paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
You want answers. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. Today, my guest is Charlie Buckholtz. How you doing, Charlie?
Great. It's great to be here, Nick. I'm really excited. This is one of my favorite podcasts, so I really am happy.
Well, thank you. Today, I'm going to diverge from talking about child abuse and/or parapolitics. And Charlie and I are going to talk about Judaism, the Kabbalah, and the Hereafter, which should make for a very interesting podcast. Charlie is known as the Bad Rabbi. Could you tell us how you got that rap, Charlie?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long story how that actual name kind of came about. I'll shorten it for you, but it has become sort of like my online identity and brand or what have you, badrabbimedia.com. And for me, Bad Rabbi, more than a particular kind of moniker for myself, it's like a way of putting out a question into the world of like, what actually is a good rabbi or a bad rabbi? And the way that it came about was that when I was working for several years as a congregational rabbi, I don't do it anymore, but when I was in, right after I got my rabbinical ordination, and at the time it was an Orthodox ordination, and I was working at an Orthodox synagogue in the East Village, and it was really an interesting time. And the people who the Jews who live in the East Village and the Lower East Side are the Jews of, the capital T, capital J Jews of kind of like American lore. And there was a lot that was great about it, but unfortunately, I disappointed some of the leaders of the congregation by not being, just not being traditional enough and not just kind of meeting their expectations for what a capital R rabbi should be. And so one of them once turned to me and said, and he said it resentfully. He said, you're a good person, but you're a bad rabbi. And the emphasis was clearly on the disappointment, and, whatever he meant by me being a good person didn't seem to hold that much weight for him. And that kind of implanted a question in my mind. What's the relationship between being a good person and a good rabbi or a good spiritual leader?
And at that point, were you crestfallen that you were a good person, but a bad rabbi?
It was disappointing and it was frustrating. I mean, part of it was that, there was the flip side of it was that I felt like I was a good rabbi and that I had a bad congregation. And I was disappointed, by the fact that they weren't responding to what I was trying to put out there in my, and what I was talking about and what I was teaching in my classes and in my sermons and things. It wasn't a good match, to put it generously, I guess, to both sides.
I've been fascinated by all religions, and I've studied many of them. And Judaism is a religion that I've studied pretty extensively. And we can get into that a little later, my attractions for Judaism. I'm not Jewish, nor have I played a Jew on television, but I've had this affinity for Judaism. And when we get into the Old Testament, when I've read the Old Testament, I've tried to tease out where these stories came from, the mythology of the New Testament. And actually, archaeology has shown that some of that mythology actually is a reality, but not most of it. And with Moses, he ostensibly wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, but he has like two different names for his wife, and he writes about his funeral in third person. So obviously Moses didn't write the Torah, but there's a theory, it's called the documentary theory, that were 4 primary contributors to the Old Testament, and maybe they collated, maybe they wrote, maybe they edited, but scholars have looked at it and they see 4 different styles. Are you familiar with that theory?
Sure. Yes.
And what do you make of that theory?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, the documentary hypothesis, the original form came out, I believe, in the 70s, and there's been a lot of updates of it since then. I'm not an academic, but I follow a lot of those academic discussions. And yeah, I think that it's kind of unsettled exactly. There are some broad places of agreement, like that, like the E and the J levels that were, there's certain agreements that like those coalesced among the Jews of certain time periods, like in the first temple. And like the priestly, the other one is the P level, which is attributed to like the temple priests and kind of projecting their perspective back into more ancient traditions. So yeah, I think that I mean, even a lot of the traditional commentary, even though they had a unitary view of the text, but they noticed, all the rabbis throughout all the generations have noticed all the same kind of disjunctures and just kind of given different explanations that, may be more or less convincing to a modern person. But there's clearly different voices that are at play in that text. And, the way that they came together and the way that they were all brought together, maybe by some master editor. That's one of the theories. Like, yeah, that seems, and also there are a lot of religious Jews who are in that field. So it used to be more of a dividing line between people who accepted an academic view and people who were kind of more religious. And those lines have become a bit more blurry, except for like the real fundamentalists.
With the flood story, the Epic of Gilgamesh is Sumerian, Mesopotamian, and people have dated it to be 5,000 years old. And then the flood story in the New Testament with Noah is similar to a certain degree. And I've always found that fascinating, where Noah releases a raven and a dove, and Gilgamesh, the Sumerian king, releases a dove, a swallow, and a raven. So obviously, I think that flood story was taken from the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yeah, I mean, another way of saying it would be that they were both drawing from, the same earlier source. Like that's a kind of, academic debate that is alive. But yeah, I definitely, I mean, I've read a lot of those. Like I've read the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Enuma Elish, where the Epic of Gilgamesh has the flood story and has a whole figure that seems to be parallel to Noah, and I would tend to think that these traditions are all like trying to describe and make sense of traditions that are about the same set of events.
It's interesting. The flood story is almost ubiquitous.
I was just going to say, if I may, because I've actually looked into a lot of Native American mythology.
Yes.
And it's fascinating. Also, there's numerous traditions of like, there's a flood that's around a creation of the world, and there's birds that are being sent out. Sometimes they're being sent out in the air, sometimes they're being sent under the water, but the sending out of birds is like a sign for when it's okay to go onto dry land. that is like really ubiquitous, which I find fascinating.
And what's interesting about the Native American Bible myth is they're all, or many of them are very, very similar, despite being at disparate parts of the country, which I find really fascinating.
Yeah, and totally across the sea and across the world from these ancient Near Eastern mythologies.
And Africa also has, there are a number of African beliefs that talk about a flood. So I think that that's definitely, for lack of a better word, an archetype for us. And what's really interesting is Moses is basically, I mean, Abraham was, I guess, the first iconoclast, but Moses was basically the fountainhead of Judaism. And what's also interesting, there was a Sumerian king named Sargon the Great, and his mother was a high priestess, and he was illegitimate, and consequently his mother put him in a basket and put him in a river and set him adrift, just like what happened with Moses. I've always found that fascinating. Sargon's got kind of a bad reputation. He was a little on the bloodthirsty side, whereas Moses doesn't appear to be that way.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating because Sargon, there are some academics who try to equate Sargon with Nimrod, the biblical figure of Nimrod, who was basically, like, in the Bible, he's regarded as the first empire builder. He built the great first cities. And I've also found that to be a fascinating twist, because he's given the same story as Moses, but he's also figured to be like an enemy of the Jewish people, whereas Moses is the savior, but like they have the same kind of origin story. It's fascinating to me.
And the Exodus is, I find the Exodus really interesting. So according to the Bible, 600,000 Jewish men left Egypt, and scholars think of it as about, because they had wives and children, it'd be about like 1.5 million people. And Egypt at that time, it's been extrapolated, had like 3.5 million people. And the Egyptians didn't write anything down about like half the society leaving. So the Exodus, and people have looked, the Jews were wandering for 40 years, and people have, a lot of archaeologists have looked for evidence of that and have not been able to find it. So I don't know what to make of the Exodus story.
That's a toughie. I agree. You know, there's a great Bible scholar who I would refer you and anybody to. He writes books. He writes a lot of academic books, but he also writes books for a popular audience. His name is Israel Knohl, Knohl. And he has a really interesting and I think compelling theory about that. It's just a part of the picture, but there is a time in ancient Egyptian history that corresponding roughly to the period that would be the period of Moses and of the Jews in Egypt, where there was a kind of like invasion by another people. They call it an invasion by another people, the Hyksos. And there, for a time, there was a leader of Egypt who was not from the like Egyptian hereditary line. And it lasted for a few centuries. And then that people was, that king was deposed and the people were exiled. The Hyksos people were exiled. That story about the Hyksos is generally accepted. What's more, you know, that what Knohl and a few other people do is they say like, that is actually the story of the Jewish people, or at least remember the documentary hypothesis, like at least like a fragment of the peoples who then came together to become the, you know, what were the 12 tribes of the Jewish people. And that was a story that was written retroactively by the descendants of those people who left Egypt.
And Israel ultimately there was Canaan, and ultimately that's where Israel ended up. And it talks about Joshua taking over the Bible talks about Joshua taking over various city states and raising them. And as far as archaeology has shown, there's only been one of those city states that was raised by fire. And but what's also fascinating is there was a victory stela. A stela is a stone with words inscribed on it. There was a victory stela. The Egyptian pharaoh was Mermetta, I believe. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his
Merneptah, yeah.
Merneptah. And that was from 1200 BC, and that stela talks about shoring the land of Israel. So they talk about that stela is from 1200 BC. That Egyptian stela is talking about how Merneptah took over the state of Israel, or conquered the state of Israel, which definitely shows that the state of Israel was around in 1200 BC.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting find. I mean, that is one of the cornerstones of, it's one of the only pieces of kind of external corroborating evidence that there is, but it's a very compelling one, I think.
And also with David, there was the king of Damascus gave a stela to one of his generals. And that was about 1000 BC. And it talks about the general killing the ruler of the house of David. So those two stelas, they show us that there was an Israel at about 1200 BC, but they also show us that David was a king in Israel.
That was a humongous find, yeah.
Which has been debated quite a bit. And do you know of any other examples where archaeology has supported the Old Testament?
Yeah, I mean, supporting the really ancient stuff. I don't. I mean, there are a few things. I don't follow the archaeology as closely as some of the other stuff. But I know of those two examples. I mean, those were, really like kind of cornerstones.
So let's hop to the Kabbalah. I was
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Because you started but kind of breezed over by saying like you've always had an affinity for Judaism, and we're delving into this deep talk about the Old Testament. Like, why do you care about any of this?
Well, I'll get into that.
There.
I was really searching, starting at I was like 16 years old. And I started reading Freud. And I quickly realized that he was not going to be the bellwether. And then I started to meditate at 15. I found a book on Eastern philosophy and I tried to meditate. And ultimately, shortly after I graduated from high school, I lived with an Indian guru. I've talked about it here. He was lecherous. But my search continued. I was then in a Krishnamurti group, and then I was in a Sufi group. And both the leaders of those, I was really, because my leaving the guru had been kind of dysphoric, I was really looking for charlatanism. And I spotted charlatanism pretty quickly, especially with the Sufi sheikh, because he was saying that his disciples had to obey him and be obsequious. And I said, well, I think that's a bad idea because, followers of Reverend Moon, should they be obsequious to him? And then he said to me, curiosity killed the cat. And so I was out of there pretty quickly. And then I got into a Gurdjieff group. And I kind of, looking of all my metaphysical exploration, I think that the Gurdjieff group was probably, when I look back at Gurdjieff, I think of him as a complete charlatan. Although I think he did say some things that were truthful, but that a lot of charlatans say things that are truthful. There's always a kernel of truth. And then I had a rigorous college, a rigorous major in college. I was a double major, philosophy and hallucinogens. And
Nice.
so, and then at that point, and this is where I kind of got into Judaism. A friend of mine who I'd met at the Guru's ashram, he had gone on to become a rabbi, and we stayed in touch. We were very, very close. And he was a rabbi in Williamsburg, and I would come out to Williamsburg, and we'd hang out. And
Was he Hasidic?
yeah, he was Hasidic.
Oh, wow.
A Lubavitcher.
Oh.
And he started talking to me about the Kabbalah, and I was always interested in metaphysical systems. So he turned me on to the Kabbalah. And actually, I wrote my senior thesis in philosophy on the Kabbalah.
Wow, that's so crazy.
So that's kind of my exploration of the various religions. But when I was writing my senior thesis on the Kabbalah, I dived pretty heavily into the Old Testament, into Judaism.
Wow.
Yourself, what made you decide to become a rabbi?
Yeah, it was a really winding road. I mean, I didn't grow up really with any Jewish religion. I grew up in the suburbs, probably like 2 generations removed from Eastern European immigrants, and just kind of like cultural Jew, high holiday Jew, proud, my parents very proud to be Jewish, proud of Israel. It's kind of like the basics for my generation. And what happened was I went to spend a semester of my junior year of college in Jerusalem, and I just had just an experience that I couldn't really explain, and it wasn't even that concrete. It was just like a feeling of like being elevated and alive in a way that I hadn't felt before. And that kind of thing, it just kind of demands a response. And so I started exploring like Jewish tradition really for the first time in my life, and just kind of like Jerusalem is a workshop for that, because there's so many different kinds of Jews doing so many different kinds of Jewish so I just got really into just like deeply Orthodox traditional text study. I was in college, I was a literature major and a fiction writer. And so I was very like open and attuned to text study in general. But when I started learning Hebrew and Aramaic, and I started learning ancient Jewish texts, that really like solidified this feeling of resonance that I had. Until there was just over several months of that kind of experimentation in Jerusalem, I just like changed my whole life around and became pretty rigorously Orthodox when I was 20, and that lasted for about 18 years. So yeah, but that was how it started, with that junior year semester in Jerusalem. But then, I mean, it really took, because I then had to go for a year and a half, graduate from college, which was out in the woods, and there was no Orthodox Jews anywhere nearby. And then I also, a few years later, did an MFA at Syracuse, and I was really far removed from any Orthodox Jews there too. So there was something that was like deeply rooted there inside me. And I eventually ended up spending 8 years in a full-time Orthodox yeshiva and becoming an Orthodox rabbi. So proof is in the pudding.
A lot of Jewish people I've met and are culturally Jewish, and basically spiritually atheist. And I think it would be tough to embrace a God after something like the Holocaust. I think that the Holocaust has really affected Judaism. And I completely understand that because of what happened to so many of Europe's Jews.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I don't really know. I would kind of have to see the numbers in a way, because, before the Holocaust, there was like the biggest, starting in the Enlightenment, like all the way up until the Holocaust, the trend was towards Jews leaving the tradition and becoming atheistic. So I would look, the Holocaust, obviously, it had a lot of terrible effects on the Jewish people. And it certainly affected a lot of people's ability to believe in God, especially people who went through it. But just, having been in there, it also, I just know from my own experience, like it also like inspired a lot of people to become Orthodox, so people are unpredictable, I guess.
Well, people like Viktor Frankl came out of the Holocaust, which I mean,
Nice.
I find
Exactly.
that just amazing to read his stuff and then know the kind of hell that he lived through. I guess what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I mean,
So,
as Nietzsche would say, and Nietzsche was not an anti-Semite, by the way. His sister was, but a lot of people have pinned that on Nietzsche. So I wrote my senior thesis in philosophy on the Kabbalah, and I found it to be a very interesting metaphysical system. What are your thoughts on the Kabbalah?
I mean, it's a big topic. I'm an avid student of Kabbalah for many years in many different forms. Yeah, I mean, what can you say? Like, it's where should we start with it?
Why don't you give us an overview of the cosmology of it?
Yeah. I mean, part of it is that there are different schools. I should narrow it down, but the main the main kind of dominant, most well-known school of Kabbalah or Kabbalah. Kabbalah is like the Ashkenazi Jewish pronunciation, and Kabbalah is like the modern Hebrew pronunciation. So the Rabbi Isaac Luria, 16th century rabbi in Tzfat, Israel, he was really the center of the school that became the dominant school of thinking of Kabbalah. And so, like, for example, there's their cosmology. Well, first of all, their account of the beginning of the world is that there was basically kind of an outflowing of pure light, right? That there was an outflowing of pure light, and that led to a shattering, what's called a shattering of the vessels, because there was some kind of fundamental disconnect between the infinite, which is the pure divine light, and the ability of finite creatures to contain it. And so the account is that there was an outflow of light, there was a shattering of vessels, and those vessels then had sparks of divine light like embedded within them. And the job fundamentally, the telos, the fundamental purpose of humanity, individually and collectively, is to figure out how to bring out the spark of light that's embedded in every created thing.
And would you say that these sparks of light are what would be called the soul?
Well, everything has a spark of light. Everything is like, has some kind of animating energy. But according to the Kabbalistic system, the soul is a more complicated thing that has different levels to it. So not like, like not every stone, every piece of wood, according to the Kabbalistic system, is animated by some kind of divine light, but doesn't necessarily have what we would call a soul.
And these vessels shattered, and they all ended up on this plane of reality.
Yeah, exactly.
As I understand it. And they were, as you said, they were attached to material, some type of matter.
Yeah, to the matter of our created world. I mean, the only reason, according to the Kabbalistic system, that our created world can exist at all is because the light is hidden. That was the whole point. If all of that light was revealed, that's the vision of what came before, and that's the vision of like the kind of post-historical messianic redemption, is when we are able to figure out how to, or to commit, it's not even quite, but to commit to that task of elevating all of the created matter in this world.
What I found interesting about the Kabbalah was that, and I'd seen this in Eastern thought, it's a pantheism or a panentheism, that everything is one. And it also incorporated reincarnation, which is really interesting because, and I think it was kind of a cultural diffusion maybe from India to the Greeks. A substantial portion of the Greeks believed in reincarnation. And then it might have gone to Greece and then to the Middle East. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, I mean, the rabbis themselves refer back to Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Pythagoras. So yeah, that may, and they were happy to like consider it a kind of inheritance of all the nations.
So with the Kabbalah, people have debated where did the Kabbalah, what was the genesis of the Kabbalah? According to certain Kabbalistic lores, it goes back to Abraham. But other people would argue that it begins in Spain at about 1250 with a Rabbi Moses de Leon, who wrote the Book of Splendor, which is the Zohar, which a lot of the Kabbalah is taken from. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, there are different. There's a couple. I mean, there's different traditions of Kabbalah. There's different traditions, but the Kabbalah, like really, like that we're talking about as we know it. I would credit that it's a manifestation of a lot of ancient traditions that had been passed down for a long time, but the kind of effusion of texts that came out starting, I mean, it started before the Zohar in Spain. There was groups of Kabbalists, but like, like starting in the 10th, 11th century, the first text that is from that period that talks about I will get to that in a minute, but the first that talks about reincarnation is like early 1200s, the Sefer HaBahir, the Book of Illumination. But yeah, I would say that like there were certainly these intense schools of Kabbalists that were in Spain. That's really what we're talking about is the tradition from Spain for the most part. And yeah, it seems like, I mean, they themselves claimed that they were inheriting ancient traditions. In the literary forms that they gave these texts, it's very clear that they're, dated. The literary manifestation is dated starting in those medieval centuries.
So a lot of Kabbalists would argue that this was an oral tradition from the Middle East.
Yeah, they do say that for sure.
That ultimately, when it ended up in Spain, it became the written word.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of like, that's kind of unknowable. I mean, I tend to credit them, with like, I mean, yeah, I tend to credit them that they didn't all like just make it up, from scratch.
the Spanish Kabbalists.
Yeah.
So pantheism is something that I believe in. I believe that everything is one. And, like Spinoza, the Jewish philosopher, rationalist Spinoza, and Albert Einstein. Einstein almost killed himself trying to create a unified field theory.
Yeah.
But, it's kind of amazing. What Einstein is saying is that, like, this cup has the energy, the speed of light is 186,000 miles per second. This cup has the energy of the speed of light squared, which contains an unbelievable amount of energy. And that kind of, it's somewhat analogous to the Kabbalah because of these sparks of
Very true.
of infinitude that came down to this plane of reality. So I've always looked at, like, the special theory of relativity and the Kabbalah as not only did Einstein believe everything was one, but just the smallest amount of matter contains mind-boggling energy. Like 186,000 miles per second squared is an unbelievable amount of energy.
Yeah, and then the crazy thing is that the Kabbalists and mystics in general, but like, is that we have that inside of us, and we also have this extra thing, which is a consciousness that has the potential to be able to guide it and give it agency.
Now, there's a lot of people that would think that the Kabbalah is Gnostic, and Gnosticism is kind of an interesting thing. There's a lot of different types of Gnosticism. And ultimately, what the Gnostics believe is that you attain enlightenment through knowledge, and that the God that is the creator of all, isn't necessarily the God that runs the show down here. The God that runs the show down here is the God that, small g, that created materialism and can be quite malevolent. But with the Kabbalah, there's Ein Sof, which is the infinite light, and that would be part of God. So I don't really look at Kabbalah as a Gnostic system.
I agree with you. Yeah, that was something that Gershom Scholem claimed. I was just reading something recently that's, I mean, there are a lot of academic, I mean, like traditional people would never accede to that for a second, but I think even a lot of academics have questioned that idea that it's Gnostic.
I was a believer in Gnosticism for quite some time. I believe that knowledge liberated one, and I read a lot of books while partaking in a very lower chakra life, and I thought, because I was reading all these books on metaphysics, that somehow trumped my lower chakra lifestyle. And
yeah, well, that's the disconnect. Even like when you were describing the Gnostic thing, there's the disconnect between the two manifestations of God. Like, yeah, that even given the Kabbalistic spherotic system, which we can get into if you want, but there's still such a strong emphasis that, like, ultimately it all just is continually in every moment getting swallowed up in the ultimateness of God that is everything.
Because when I was 15, or when I was 25, I realized that that although I'd read all these books, that my lower chakra lifestyle had left me somewhat spiritually bankrupt. And I was pretty stunned by that revelation, because I had believed that reading all the books that I had read was advancing me spiritually, but it really wasn't. And I came across this quote by Pascal about that same time, and Pascal said, "Vantage is sought, or knowledge is sought out of vanity, because once we learn something, we just want to tell other people that we've learned it." and I realized I'd fallen into that trap.
There you go. what did you find did lead to real growth?
Well, I had to kind of eschew the lower chakra lifestyle, and I mean, it's hard to completely eschew the lower chakra lifestyle, but because those lower chakras are always whispering. But,
So cleaner life.
But I realized I had to start living a much different kind of life.
Yeah.
And which gets us to reincarnation. That was one of the things that I found very attractive about the Kabbalah. It's interesting. The Hindus believe in reincarnation. The Buddhists believe in reincarnation. There's a sect of Muslims called the Sufis who believe in reincarnation. The Jewish mystics of the Kabbalah lineage believe in reincarnation. And actually, there were early Christian church fathers that believed.
Oh, Origin, right?
Yeah, that believed in reincarnation. But there was a homicidal Roman emperor called Justinian, who assembled all the Christian bishops in Constantinople, and he said, "I don't want reincarnation."
Right.
So now, if you're a bishop, you don't want to tangle with a homicidal Roman emperor. So that was the end of reincarnation with Christianity, which I think is kind of a shame. I mean, I think Constantine very much disrupted Christianity. I think if Christianity had been allowed to evolve without another homicidal Roman emperor meddling with it, I think it would have evolved much differently. And also with Justinian, his little dictum of no reincarnation also, I think, affected Christianity quite a bit. But when I was
religion and state, not a good mix. Generally,
that?
Religion and state, not a great mix. Generally,
they should be separated.
Indeed.
When I was 6 years old, I had a dream that there's no way I should have had this dream. I dreamt that I was a Jew escaping a concentration camp. Now, I was born in Minneapolis, and my mom quickly dispensed with my biological father, which was a very good idea for her. And we moved to Chicago, and she became a Playboy bunny there. And we moved in with another bunny. So, and I'm not bullshitting about this. My first memory is of my mom getting her tails and ears back from the dry cleaner. So
amazing.
So I didn't have religion growing up. I didn't know what Jews were. I didn't know what Nazis were. So that dream was really real, really palpable, and it stuck with me because I had no idea of how I could have dreamt that. And then while I was writing,
you didn't know Jews growing up at all, or did you?
I didn't know Jews. I didn't know Christians. I knew Playboy bunnies.
Right. Amazing.
And also the guys that wanted to date Playboy bunnies. That was the extent of
cream of the crop. Yeah.
That was the extent of my reality. So I had this dream, which was completely inexplicable. And then I was writing my senior thesis in philosophy on the Kabbalah, and I had my buddy Jimmy turned me on to the Tanya, which is it was written by the third Rebbe of Hasidism, and I think it's the go-to text for Jewish Kabbalists. Would you agree with that, or that it's an important?
That is, well,
Kabbalah?
it is. Yes, that's a good edit. It's a very important text. It sounds to me like you were told about the text by Lubavitchers, because that's how they think of it. It was written by the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. Like that's the more objective. They think of him as being the third Rebbe of Hasidus, but there were a lot of third generation. He had a lot of comrades who other people think of as, as that. But the Tanya is definitely a very important go-to text, especially as an entry point to the Kabbalah of the Ari, Isaac Luria. Yes.
So I'd read Isaac Luria. I'd read all these different accounts of Kabbalah. And a lot of it gets into magic. That kind of lost me. It didn't really, I really didn't know what they were talking about. And actually, there's Kabbalah today. I mean, when I tell people that I wrote my senior thesis in philosophy on the Kabbalah, they ask me, "Is it like Madonna? I mean, or Britney Spears?" And I said, "No, no, it's very different." But so I had some questions for my. I read the Tanya, and I had some questions for my buddy Jimmy. And this is way before the internet. This was when people used phones. So to make long distance phone calls, it costed them a lot of money. And I called up my buddy Jimmy in Williamsburg, and I said, "Jimmy, now I'm having problems understanding this and that and this and that." And he gave me the number to the Kabbalistic heavy of heavies who was in Chicago, and I cannot remember his name.
It wasn't Rav Moshe Miller, was it? Rav Moshe Miller? Does that ring a bell? Moshe Miller?
It could have been.
Okay.
This was back in 1987. So, but so we were talking about the Kabbalah, and I had a bunch of questions, and then we got around to reincarnation, and I told him about my dream, and I said, I mean, we've got three ontological options: reincarnation, heaven and hell, or the lights go out and Elvis leaves the building. And I said, I had this dream when I was 6 years old that there's no way I should have had that dream. And he asked me what it was about. And I said, I was a Jew escaping from a concentration camp, and I hid behind this bush that didn't have any leaves on it. And a German put his gun to the back of my head and shot me. And he asked me if I was tall, and I said, I'm 6'4". He said, you have blue eyes? And I said, yes, I have blue eyes. And he said, you have blonde hair? And I said, well, was blonde. Now it's getting a little darker. And I said, how did you know that about me? And he goes, because I've talked to a number of survivors, or people who think that they survived the camps or were killed in the camps. And most of them come back as tall, blonde-haired, and blue-eyed. And I'd read something by Rudolf Steiner, who said that the laws of the physical world or the laws of the spiritual world are exactly the opposite laws of the physical world. So maybe that accounts for it. I don't know why, but that kind of gave me, that kind of reinforced it. I wasn't sold, but it reinforced it. And when I was 32 years old, I met a first cousin of mine. I'd never met her before. My family is somewhat fragmented. Her father was one of my uncles who had a bad time in Vietnam, and he came back to his wife and little girl, and then the wife just split. So, and they hadn't really been in touch too much. So I met her for the first time in my 30s, and she was living in Salt Lake City, and we were completely different. She was into Rush Limbaugh and wearing Prada and chemical. I mean, she was very, very different than me, but we had a connection that was really profound. And because there's no way that we should have had that connection.
How did the connection manifest itself? Just
manifest itself as we really loved each other. And it was like kind of immediate type thing where, you know, it was kind of like you meet an old friend or something like that. And we became very, very close, even though we really shouldn't have. I mean, we had no, and I never.
What did you have to talk about?
Well, that was the thing. She was really witty. So we would have, she had a great sense of humor. So we would have very witty conversations, but we never talked about philosophy. And I never mentioned what I've just told you. And I do believe that there are psychics that aren't charlatans. I think that some people get more radio signals than others. I believe that. I think a lot of them are charlatans, but I don't think all of them are charlatans. And she went to a psychic, and I guess I don't know the machinations of her ending up with the psychic, but anyway, she said, why am I so close to my cousin Nick? I don't understand. We're so different, but yet we're so close. And the psychic said, well, you were a brother and sister in your past lifetime, and he was a young boy, and he was killed in the camps. and that, and then she told me about that. And then,
oh my God.
and then it blew me away. But here's the thing about a couple of things. For all those years, I wondered, why did I just not keep running? Why did I hide behind the bush that had no leaves? Because common sense would dictate that I would just keep running, that I'd have a much better chance of running than hiding behind a bush. And it was because I was a little kid. And I've had 2 major neurosurgeries. And that's the other thing about people who suffer grave wounds and then come back. There's often a birthmark there. I've got a huge scar on the back of my head from my 2 neurosurgeries. And what's really interesting, they're at the University of Virginia Department of Perceptual Studies, they've looked at they found like 2,500 people and been able to trace them back to their find evidence of their previous lives. James Lessinger is, I think, probably the most prominent. Are you familiar with the University of Virginia Department?
Yeah, no, Ian Stevenson. Dr. Ian Stevenson. Yeah, I read at least one of his books, and I'm familiar broadly with that research.
So they've really approached it empirically.
Yes.
And I think what they've done, and they have also worked with near-death experiences. I really do believe not only that they show that with the near-death experiences, there is consciousness that goes somewhere else in near-death experiences. Do you have any recollections or thoughts about a previous life? Or
it's funny, I really didn't prepare for you to ask me that question. It's my own fault. I should have seen it coming. But I don't have any like concrete dreams like that. I've actually never even said this to anyone out loud, but I do have a very strong recurring like, I don't know what to exactly call it, because it's like a day. It's stronger than a daydream because it feels real, like when it's happening. But I get overtaken by this like sense of being burned at the stake. This like, it feels like a memory of being burned at the stake for heresy. So
you're possibly a heretic.
I mean, it doesn't feel wrong exactly. You know, I've definitely always been or felt kind of at odds with the surrounding culture. So
one of the things about reincarnation, I don't really talk to too many people about it because the story that I just told you was kind of tedious. But when people talk about their past lives, they come back as they're either Napoleon or Marie Antoinette or Peter the Great. And I generally don't get into it. I haven't found too many people that were peasants and have come back from previous lifetimes.
Well, I have to say, Nick, I hear that. I did a little research. I mean, I showed you this book when we spoke last. It's called I've Been Here Before, When Souls of the Holocaust Return, but I hadn't read it at the time. I had actually just recently got it because a friend of mine recommended it. I hadn't gotten into it yet, but like, you should get this book because yeah, it like you should be in this book. Honestly, the stories are so interesting, and the author Sarah Yocheved Rigler is her name, and she talks about that exact thing, that a lot of people's skeptical response to her was like, oh, like everybody's you know, somebody famous in a past life. But she collected hundreds of stories of people. She calls it a secret society, actually, because she was embarrassed to start talking about it. But as soon as she started talking about it, like all these other people started coming out of the woodwork and sharing their stories. And what is so fascinating to her, and this is part of what in her introduction to the book, where she talks about what lends the stories a lot of credibility to her, and there's different factors. But one is like what you're saying, like people who like didn't grow up around any Jews or anything, and like wouldn't have had any way of knowing any of this stuff, any frame of reference for it, and and that's one thing. But with the least credibility. What was I going to say? I just lost my train of thought.
You were talking about the book and how people have similar stories, or that.
Yeah.
They
Right.
weren't.
Sorry. Yeah. No, exactly.
Most
No,
of them
I remember.
weren't even aware of Judaism.
Yeah, I remember what I was saying. Oh, and so another one is like, just there's an incredible specificity of detail in these little kind of slivers of vignettes, like incredible vividness and specificity of detail. And that I thought was something that, and also it's just like, there are a lot of stories of just like random people, just like somebody in a house with their family. Like that's the majority of the stories that I was reading these stories, and like they really reminded me of what you had told me in a prior conversation about what you remembered. And you also, it's actually a whole thing. You were saying why would that be that there's all of these souls from the Holocaust that are, getting reincarnated into the bodies of non-Jews. And I wasn't even like specifically looking for that, but it actually was a huge topic of conversation among some of the Hasidic rabbis of the time. Can I read you a little
Go
piece?
for it.
Yeah. So it says, this is, okay, the Klausenberger Rebbe. This is in America. Rabbi Yekusiel Yehuda Halberstam, himself a survivor who lost his wife and all 11 of his children in the Holocaust, in 1970, told someone interviewed for this book that so many Jewish souls from the Holocaust want to return, and there are not enough Jewish mothers to receive them, so they're going to non-Jewish mothers. I just think it's interesting. I mean, this is, obviously it's just food for thought, but I think that's, fascinating to me that he like what this is like a matter of communal importance. This is like, what does he have to gain? But you know what I mean? Like he clearly like really was perceiving something and meant it. And it actually applies to me too. I was telling you that I grew up like with zero religious background and became religious, and she says here that there were also rabbis who said that because it was like in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s, there was a big movement of people like that who had kind of grown up with no Jewish background and became very religious. That was like, it's called the Baal Tshuva movement. A Baal Tshuva is somebody who becomes Orthodox after not being religious. And they said that those were also reincarnated souls from the Holocaust. Oh, one thing I wanted to say, because he says further, this is a different modern Hasidic Rebbe, like talking about the same thing. Like these are people with thousands and thousands of adherents. Like these are really significant in that world, in the Hasidic world, very serious, credible people. Sorry. So he says these souls, the souls from the Holocaust that are reincarnated into the bodies of non-Jews, these souls are fiery souls, souls of holy and pure people who were killed for the sanctification of God's name. These souls truly are on greater spiritual levels, and so their eyes are opened, and they see things and hear things differently.
Well, that kind of leaves me out, but so this has kind of come full circle. Earlier, you asked me, why did I explore Judaism? Why did I have an affinity in Judaism? And that I've just given you the exact reason why. And I wouldn't consider myself a Jew, and as I said, nor have I played one on television. I'm actually the sect that I feel the most comfortable with of all the metaphysical exploration I've done. The sect that I feel the most comfortable with are the Quakers. And they're at this point in my life the only organized religion that I attend, which isn't regularly, is Quaker meetings, and I feel comfortable there. And now, what I've just been talking about, if people ask me, most Christians would say I'm not a Christian. So, but what can you do?
Well, I fully accept you as a Jew. So I'm curious, actually, have you ever done any past life regression hypnosis?
No, I've never done any of that. I kind of, what I've talked about was kind of my big revelation. And I'm one of those guys that just kind of moves on from that type of a revelation. Because I think that with most things, I don't want to get bogged down. And I keep my mind open and go on to the next thing. Like the Franklin scandal completely changed my life, the trajectory of my life.
Yeah.
I was a pretty easygoing freelance writer living in Greenwich Village with a beautiful girlfriend. And some years later, I'm living in a hovel in Brooklyn without the beautiful girlfriend. So
really brought you low.
But that's one thing that philosophy gave me, is to keep my mind open. Socrates, for him, it was very important to approach everything agnostically. And I really try to approach everything agnostically. As crazy as things sound, I still try to approach it agnostically until I have some proof one way or the other. Franklin in and of itself sounds pretty crazy.
Totally.
But and I continue to try to live that way today. It's so hard to keep one's mind open. As we get older, our minds just want to close. And one of the reasons I read this in a Emmett Fox wrote a little book on reincarnation, and he said the reason why we go through the reincarnation process is at a certain point we just stop growing. And
wow.
And then reincarnation, when you're young, your mind is open to a lot of different things, and that's why we need the reincarnation, is to become young again, to open our minds.
I read something very parallel to that in one of the medieval Kabbalists when I was just kind of refreshing for this talk. So that really resonates.
Well, Charlie, aka Bad Rabbi, it's been great having you on the Nick Bryant podcast.
Nick, it's truly an honor. The only thing that I regret about coming onto the podcast is that it means that there's going to be a week that I don't have something new to listen to on your podcast. So a little ambivalent about that, but I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm really always happy to talk to you. So thank you.
Thank you so much, and have a great night.
Thanks, you too.
Okay, bye.